we could say, hey, we're going to put up speed cameras everywhere. We're going to delegate more police to watch the roads at certain junctures. We're going to install more radar trucks to monitor people's speed. But that's a political appetite thing. That's a community appetite thing. And I'm just not sure we're there.
Welcome back to Cambridge Forum, ladies and gentlemen. We're coming to you live via Zoom. My name is Daniel Berger-Jones. I'm the new host of Cambridge Forum, and today we're taking a hard look at our unsustainable obsession with the automobile. Around the world, cars are responsible for the deaths of roughly 1.3 million people annually, and kill even more through air pollution and other environmental hazards. So it's our dependency on cars, it's draining the Earth's natural resources. Their carbon emissions are driving climate change, and they create unsafe streets and congestion, which make the planet, or at least I can speak for Boston, increasingly unlivable. Despite knowing all of this, we continue to ignore the impact and the expense in favor of the sheer convenience of just going really fast between places. And we remain worshiping at the altar of the auto. We're refusing to surrender the comforts and distraction afforded by our wheels. But where is that breaking point that will force us to pay attention to the true costs of our driving addiction? To help us explore the true price of our auto obsession, we have three experts with us today whose knowledge will help fill in the blanks. We'll start with Matt Scher, who's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and a fellow at New America. His work appears all over the place, including the publications Esquire, National Geographic, The Atlantic, and Harper's. And he's also the host of the podcast Origin Stories. He joins us this evening from Atlanta in a Boston Red Sox cap. Hello, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We've got Arthur Kay as well. He's an entrepreneur and an urban designer helping build solutions for sustainable cities. He's a man who wears many hats, serves on a number of boards, including the Board of Transport for London and the Board of the Royal Academy of Engineering. He's an associate professor and entrepreneur in residence at the University College of London's Institute for Global Prosperity and co-author of a new book, Roadkill, Unveiling the True Cost of Our Toxic Relationship with Cars. He is joining us enviously from Venice. So thank you so much for staying up so late to chat with us today, Arthur. Finally, Professor Ryan C. Martin is a psychologist and leading expert in anger management and emotional wellness. He's written books including How to Deal with Angry People and spends hours examining why people experience anger and how to channel it productively, including in driving settings, thank goodness. He's the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Wisconsin and joins us this evening from Green Bay. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'd love to dive right in if that's all right. And Matt, can we start with you? You wrote an in-depth cover story for New York Times Magazine called The Road to Ruin, which contained a number of just shocking and startling statistics connected with cars. For example, after decades of declining fatality rates, dangerous driving has now just surged in America. And last year alone, we had nearly 43,000 traffic deaths in this country. And the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety concluded that SUVs or vans with a hood height greater than 40 inches, which is kind of the standard issue for American trucks in 2023, those massive vehicles are 45% more likely to kill pedestrians than smaller cars. Are there any other worrying trends that you uncovered researching this piece that you could share with us this evening?
I mean, there's probably too many to include in a brief opening, but it's a real cocktail of horrible factors. Some of the other folks on this panel will be able to speak to the psychological issues at play. But if we're thinking just of cars, for example, yeah, trend towards bigger cars, trend towards taller cars, trend towards cramming the equivalent of a sports bar inside the center console of a car, screens everywhere, more people texting, deterioration of road surfaces and infrastructure that is being repaired at, a quarter of the rate that we're destroying it. And then you add in all the other stuff, anger, frustration, all the things that we saw burble up during the pandemic. And it's it's a really frightening combination, and that's what you're seeing right now in these figures.
Absolutely. They, you said that 31% of new cars in the United States, so that's a third of them basically, are over 5,000 pounds compared to 22% in 2018. So that's a huge upward trend as well. It went from a third to a fifth. Sorry, a fifth of them to a third of them are these humongous things, and the number of pedestrians killed has almost doubled since 2010. Right. So some of the attraction, I think, to these colossal cars is power and prestige, but at this point, it's sort of a chicken and an egg situation, right? Just for safety, because if I drive a smart car and I'm hit by a Hummer, like we know who survives, right? Why do you think these SUVs are designed more like tanks than cars? And what's behind the obsession with these larger, heavier, menacing cars with militaristic and intimidating names?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that ship has sailed, right? I've been a car and driver reader for most of my life, and I like cars. I like trucks. And I've watched, you can see in the reviews of the types of vehicles that Car and Driver covers, sedans have been on their way out for decades, right? There are really only a few sedans left in the United States, and probably everyone on this call can mention them, the Accord, the Camry. Most cars that are purchased right now are SUVs by an enormous majority. People like the safety, they like the road position, they like the sense of power that comes from them. They just think they're cool and the way that's ineffable and hard to define, but is just completely enduring. And it's just not going away, right? I mean, manufacturers, this is a consumer led change to the market. Consumers wanted these cars. They stopped buying sedans. So I don't think that that's going back. The more recent trend that you touch on a little bit is pickup trucks and the sort of jumbo SUVs, which are, where does that come from? I have all sorts of political, sociological theories. It's obvious that there is a certain prestige that comes from having an absolutely gigantic truck that allows you to tower over the road. There is clearly in rural communities and more conservative communities an affiliation between politics and pickup trucks. That's not going away or going back. But I come back to this idea that it is a sense of, we are increasingly vulnerable on the roads, and we're aware that we're increasingly vulnerable. And I had a lot of people say to me after the article came out, well, I'm liberal. I don't want more car crashes, but I want a Suburban because I want what it the feeling that it gives me. And I'll just say as a final thought, my wife and I recently rented on a trip a Jeep Grand Wagoneer, which I think costs about $110,000, is an absolute monster. I've never driven anything so big. And we got finished with that trip and we're like, wow, that was surprisingly pleasant and fun to drive that thing. Now, there's a cost to all of this. There's nothing comes for free. And especially, it's interesting, it's mostly with pedestrians, and that's what you cite here. When these vehicles do get bigger, it's pedestrians who pay the price. Because if anyone's listening and they've driven one of these cars, you can't see a dang thing anywhere. You can't see the hood goes like this, right? It's like you stand in front of these cars and you're I'm short, granted, but even if I was taller, I would barely be able to see over. So I don't know. It raises worrying issues. I just not sure I feel whatever the metaphor is, that horse has left the barn when it comes to the SUVs.
There's also, I think, the element of cool factors. Like, would you rather be driving a Hummer or a Fiat Cinquecento? I mean, there's certainly a sense of one is going to make you look cooler. But yeah, as you said, in Boston, we had a pedestrian who was just a kid who the driver said, I didn't see him. I didn't see him.
Mhm.
He was right under the hood and therefore could not actually see the kid. That said, if so, again, from your article, you said that 10% of vehicles, if 10% of vehicles in the US were to shrink just by 1,000 pounds, right, just by 20%, it would reduce fatalities by 12%. And, my math says in a country where 43,000 people die, that saves 5,100 lives a year. So do people just not know that? Or do car manufacturers not care? What do you think is the
I think it's like when I was writing this article, I kept thinking about the gun debate in America. It's a little like guns. It's like, we know what guns do. Like no one has ceased to understand what the damage a gun can do, but we still want them. A sizable portion of America does, and we've made some trade-off in our mind that, I think there are some people who don't know that big trucks can cause this much damage. I think there's some people who do and choose to just be like, well, whatever, I'm responsible. I can handle it. This is what I want. And I mean, analogous to the gun debate, you haven't said this yet, Daniel, but this is the only country where this is still a problem at the scale that it is with guns and with cars. It's like there are plenty of quote unquote developed countries that have a lot of the same kind of cars, but they are not dealing with the same proportion of deaths for some of these reasons and some we can get into later.
It's shocking. Again, I mean, violent gun deaths, non-suicide related, I think is fewer than 30,000, and we have 43,000 people dying on the highways. And for some reason, that's not a hot topic in the same way that gun violence is. But I have a question from the audience that I'd like to address, which is to what extent is the increasing weight of the cars related to the weight inherent in hybrids, in electric vehicles with these humongous batteries?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I want to let other people answer too, because I know there's some folks on the panel who know a lot about this. But yeah, I mean, look, if you back to Car and Driver, they publish the weight of every car that they review, and hybrids, yes, but electrics most of all weigh an absolute ton. They weigh so much because there is so much battery to cram in there. And talk about something that's not a horse that's not going back in the barn. I mean, we're pushing in that direction. We want more electrics. Electrics are heavier. And yeah, I mean, it plays an obvious role in deaths and injuries. The heavier a vehicle, the faster it's traveling, the more destruction it causes. It's just a super simple equation. But again, this is one where, maybe people don't care. Maybe they think, oh, it's an electric car. I'm willing to make a trade-off in some way.
On the pickup on those things as well. I mean, the acceleration, I like to joke, there's a speed limit, but there's no acceleration.
I the one time I have seen, Car and Driver, I'm going to talk about Car and Driver until someone forces me to stop. The one time I've seen them be recently critical of the car industry had to do with it. There's a Tesla that can go from 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. It's got something called a launch control. And there was a line in there. The columnist was like, "This is a weapon." And how could it not be a weapon? If someone can get into a car and press a button and accelerate like a rocket, you don't need training to do that. I mean, it's terrifying. And as you say, it's also a different kind of acceleration for people who've been in an electric. With a gas powered car, you press down and you can feel the car. With the electrics, it's like there's no feel. There's not a lot of road or engine feel. So it really is just suddenly your head snapped back and you're flying.
Absolutely. Um, and then there's of course the addition of the stuff inside the vehicles, right? We have smartphones, we have you know, which obviously overlaps closely with the increase in pedestrian deaths, but it doesn't seem to be this way everywhere. And since we have an actual person from Europe in Europe at the moment, I'll shift over a little bit, Arthur, to you. Um, are these huge, large cars a primarily American trend? And we also have this thing where we like automatic cars in this country. It's cheaper at a car rental place to get a manual, a stick shift, because there are quite a few of us who don't know how to drive one. Whereas, 1% of passenger vehicles in the US are manual. In Europe, it's 75% manual. So in the US, our hands are free for fiddling around with stuff. And that means that Americans statistically spend about 3 times as much time on their phones interacting while driving compared to British drivers. And then there's the prosecution, right? We don't tend to do that as much. Even here in Massachusetts, where we're really thinking about it, there's about 50,000 tickets given out for distracted driving as opposed to the 90,000 speeding tickets. So do you think it would change anything if we went manual? And the other big question is just this trend of huge American cars. Is that exclusive to us?
Well, I mean, firstly, Daniel, let me say thank you very much for having me here. I'm here representing one part of a duo who have written this book. My co-author, Professor Dame Henrietta Moore, sends her apologies. She's currently presenting at something called the Healthy Cities Conference in Salford in Manchester. so she can't be here, but very much sends her regards. The short answer, Daniel, I'm afraid to say is yes. That trend, as ever in America, it's bigger, it's faster, there's more of it, but those trends are represented across Europe. And also, I've just come over from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and that makes the scale of car there makes parts of America look positively European in their outlook. So I think every place has different scales as well in terms of that level of car dependency and car adoption as well. And to your specific question around would some of these things help towards it, I'd say yes. A lot of these things can nudge our way towards it. So certainly raise awareness is a critical element of it. And a huge thanks to the Cambridge Forum for flagging this as an issue because it is so acute. And as you say, comparing it to gun deaths, I think is a helpful proxy or analogy for it. But what we really argue for in the book is, I guess, zooming out from some of those incremental changes. So can you move from, can you prosecute more effectively? Yes. Can you reduce, lower the bonnets? Yes. Can you do what they've done in Paris about taxing SUVs more aggressively? Yes. And all these things do be to force. But what we're interested in is the massive increase in total, what's called VMT. The nerds amongst us will know, a vehicle miles traveled. And what we've gone from in about 70 years, we've gone from a world in which we traveled not that far in cars. By the end of the Second World War, we were traveling a few billion vehicle miles a year. Last year, globally, we traveled 17 trillion miles globally. So the amount of distance we're traveling in cars, the scale of cars, the gross tonnage of car in the world, we've gone from zero cars roughly 125 years ago to 1.6 billion cars today. And our assessment in terms of these three big cogs that we'll come on to talk about in a second, Daniel, but we see a world in which that in the next 15 to 20 years, humanity will be driving 100 trillion miles a year. We're not only accelerating, literally, as in a Tesla going from 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds, but we're also accelerating just the sheer number of miles driven. And that's happening, as you identified, Matthew, in your fantastic article, in both the scale of car, and we can come on to talk about the economic costs as well, because we really try and move this argument on to talk about when we talk about the toxic relation, we're talking about that in a whole bunch of ways. And Professor Martin, I'm very keen to learn about some of the road rage and the anger management issues that sit alongside this as well.
Well, and this isn't just, people going on vacation at a higher rate, right? Deciding to drive across the country to visit their relatives. This feels like an unstoppable trend of everybody wants to be in their own personal little vehicle. But there's also, I've just been informed that I read a great book called Big Car by David Obst, who happens to be in the audience. It was a phenomenal read. I recommend it for anybody. And he goes into a lot of the history of how sort of this all happens. Our cities are now designed around the car industry. And Arthur, as an urban expert, design expert, you've got all the experience to see that it doesn't feel like the design of our cities and the way that we interact with each other, as we globalize, is going to be very helpful for that. So your book is entitled Roadkill. I'm just curious, why did you call it Roadkill? What does the title encompass, and how can we reframe our relationship with the automobile, where it seems like it's a trend that is unstoppable at this point?
Yeah, so it's an intentionally provocative title. So it's Roadkill, unveiling the true cost of our toxic relationship with cars. So we're not pulling any punches in terms of that, and we're proactively trying to bring the book to places where maybe we're not most welcome. So we're off to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia shortly. We've just been in the United Arab Emirates. We spent time in the United States and very car-centric cities and car-dependent cities around the world. And the message of the book is really simple. It's saying we've become incredibly car dependent and become reliant on the car. And in the same way that you may one, I'm sure we've got, several hundred people in the audience here, in the same way that some of us may have a challenging, even toxic relationship with a friend or a family member or something like that. It's about saying we don't need to necessarily never speak to that person again or cut them out of life or say they're a terrible person, I'm morally great and you're morally bad. It's not looking to provide any moral judgment on people who drive. I mean, I drive, loads of people drive. It's absolutely fine to have a way to get around. It's saying how can you build a positive and proactive relationship with them, but critically on your terms, on the terms of a human being rather than the terms of a car. And so very, very crudely, we look at it from the perspective of what freedoms are we giving up by becoming car dependent, and what freedoms can we reclaim by giving additional mobility options? I mean, the example I often think about is we typically think of as Europe and particularly Northern Europe as having a lot of solutions, and then other parts of the world not. But I give the example of my grandmother, who lives in Dublin, just outside of Dublin, in the kind of suburbs of Dublin. And she's 92. She lived in the same house for around 60 years. And her mobility is going down in terms of she can walk less well and all the rest of it. But as she walks out of her house, there is no sidewalk as she walks out of her house. There is no, because it's suburban, there's no option for a bus. She's too old to cycle. So her freedoms are hugely constrained by only being able to go out of her house if she's driving, or to risk literally being run over on a busy road. And so when we talk about freedom, sometimes it can be incredibly prosaic, very literal in terms of saying she is locked, but almost in a physical sense, inside her home and doesn't have access to be able to move around it. And that's partly her decision that she's chosen to live in this part of the city, but also, and what we talk about in the book is the multitude of actions that need to happen to unbind our cities from some of these freedoms, to throw off the shackles of car dependency, and to give other options to people that might range from a child, as Matthew was talking about earlier, being run over by a truck, or that's literally physically larger than a tank. I mean, the Panzer I tank that was used to invade Europe by the Nazis in the Second World War is smaller than quite a lot of the trucks driving around America today. So I mean, this is literally tanks driving around our cities. And also all the way through to the ability for an old woman to be able to pootle around her neighborhood.
Well, there's also the element, you mentioned the freedoms here. I think there's a perception in the United States of America that we're giving up our freedom of privacy if we deign to use public transportation. Again, in David Opes' book, he references Taipei has got this incredible public transportation system. There's a culture that's shifting towards that. And there's a member of our audience who is wondering, do you know what the statistics look like for Japan, given their use of bullet trains rather than cars to go speedily between places, which is even more efficient, gets you there even faster? Is that something, again, I feel like there's this American trend of, if I take public transportation, that's some sort of invasion of my privacy. Do you think there's any kind of messaging that could be effective towards encouraging people to share their space, and especially in terms of city planning?
I think there is, and there are lots of different examples of this around the world. What I would maybe perhaps gently caution is that the cultural elements are really critical here. And let me give you two examples. One is in Estonia, the capital of Estonia, and one is a city in the south of France. And both cities at around the same time made the really bold and proactive choice to make public transit completely free. So a citizen could go on to any form of public transit, and as long as they showed their residence card, they could use that public transit for free. In Tbilisi, public transit actually went down. Usage went down from roughly 40% to 30%, and private car ownership actually increased. And this sounds completely bonkers, because in terms of conventional, rational economic theory, if you're giving something, perhaps giving something away for free, and if that service is a good service, then you would expect it to potentially go up. And what the researchers who kind of dug deeper into this and discovered was that part of it was deep cultural factors, in terms of being a former, part of the USSR and part of the communist regime, feeling that to your point, Daniel, and we were talking about a bit earlier with Matthew about the high status element and of owning, being in a private space, and critically having the wherewithal and economic ability to be able to drive was a status symbol in that society, meaning that actually using public transit was seen as a handout, was seen as being communal, and seen as being back in the 80s, 70s, and 60s, rather than something that was the kind of the future and a more, let's say, kind of capitalist or Western focused model of development. And this model of development thing is something that we talk about in the book, and I know it's touched on a bit in Big Car as well, in terms of that I mean, very, very crudely, before we wrote this book, I had this idea that everyone before Henry Ford was having a pretty rubbish time getting around cities and didn't really have any other options. And horses were pooing everywhere and dying all over the place, and it was kind of chaos. And then suddenly this genius came along, scaled up automobile production, and then everything was awesome. And what we discovered was the history, in particular, at the turn of I kind of think of this kind of rich, biodiverse tapestry of options of mobility. I discovered this amazing person who was a suffragette called Lady Priscilla Norman, who would zip around central London giving speeches using an electric e-scooter. Now, I thought the e-scooter was something that was kind of, Lime and Bird and these other innovators from Silicon Valley in the 2010s. But to find someone in 1915 using an e-scooter that came in both an electric and a diesel model was extraordinary. The e-bike was not scaled up by in the United States in 1897. So some of these inventions and some of these innovations that we're now adopting are actually from a world where we had a lot of mobility options, and those were massively constrained by the kind of monocrop, to use it to play this out, this monocrop of the car. And then critically, from both that then became codified in the legal system, and then critically after the Second World War became exported to cities around the world. And I hope to come back, I mean, if we have time, to come back to talk about what's happening in the global south in particular in terms of car adoption.
The Stanley steamer is a long ago memory as well. I mean, these are things that it's amazing how much innovation was there at the beginning, and now we've sort of gotten stuck in this little rut, which feels unfortunate, to say the least. Ryan, by the way, you're there. You're being so patient and kind, and thank you so much for hanging out while we go through some of these questions. I promise we will get to you soon. I just want to hit one more topic with Arthur, because in your book you mentioned the miracle of 14th Street. So speaking of culture, just between Boston and New York, the culture is so vastly different, as I probably need to tell nobody on this call, certainly not Matt with his Red Sox hat on. Represent. Thank you, sir, for wearing that this evening. But in New York, the miracle of 14th Street is, for those who are unfamiliar, where New York City bans non-essential cars on 14th Street. Side streets are going bananas, right? 15th and 13th Street go, it's all going to come to us. But miraculously, that's not what happened at all. They are not congested. Buses instead on 14th begin to travel their routes more smoothly. They're beating their schedules. Residents are experiencing less noise pollution, and everybody seemed really happy. Do you have any explanation for why did that work so well? Is it just because New York City is a grid and maybe that wouldn't work in other cities?
I think when one does kind of pedestrianize or move, I don't think of it as a binary of either cars everywhere or no cars at all is necessarily the right way to think about it. The way we kind of try and frame it in the book, and again, this is adopting a lot of kind of transport engineers' approach to it, is thinking of it more as a spectrum of levels of car dependency. At one end, you're my grandmother, who has the only option is to drive. And at the other end, there's pure pedestrianisation, which might be standing in the middle of Central Park where you can't get a car to, kind of thing. And so, but in the middle, there's this kind of grey space, and in the same way, we should be thinking about what those different levels are. So the way transport engineers think about it today is more as a priority pyramid. At the top of that pyramid today, in a lot of cities around the world, the car exists. As I mentioned earlier, I had a bizarre incident in Dubai where I've just come back from, as I mentioned. My step cousin had to is for a long convoluted story, but had to retake her driving test whilst in Dubai. And there's a kind of a discussion amongst your fellow applicants for your driving test with the instructor, and the instructor said, "Who has right of way on the road?" And she kind of quietly put up her hands, had some ideas to alert, but the person next to her jumped and said, "The person with the biggest car." And so literally, Matthew, I mean, to your points earlier, when you're talking about, the big cars being, having both safety features that mean that you win the accident, as well, win the crash. Literally in Dubai, drivers think that if you own the bigger car, you have actual priority and right of way on the road. So it does trickle through into all sorts of things within that as well.
I assume that the right of way in Venice is less of a contentious issue on the canals there, but who knows? Who knows? It's funny because I spent some time in Warsaw where the right of way is for the trolley, and if a car gets in the middle of it, the trolley absolutely has the legal ability to run through that car, which was shocking to me. But as a result, guess what? They all respect the right of way of the trolley, which fair enough. Maybe we could learn a lesson for that. All right, Ryan, thank you so much for your patience. We've been talking so much about the outside of the car. I feel like the inside of the car is equally important to what's happening in the world of cars these days, specifically in the heads of the drivers who are understandably getting frustrated with the other drivers on the road. I know I am susceptible to this weakness. So you're a psychologist who specializes in anger management. We know that the behavior of drivers has changed dramatically in the past decade. Research shows that the five contributory factors leading to car fatalities are the new technologies, the increased speed, seat belts or the lack thereof, impairment, and distraction. So how do all these factors add up to affect the mindset of the average driver?
Yeah. So first of all, no patience required at all. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm really glad to have been able to hear all of that. I'll tell you, I think a big piece of what's going on psychologically for people, and I'll just quickly add that one other thing that I bring to this conversation is that of a dad who is currently teaching his 15-year-old how to drive. And so I'm right. So I'm sort of discovering a lot of things, or rediscovering a lot of things as I do that. But I think what's going on for a lot of people psychologically are there are a lot of illusions or even delusions around safety, right? There's a delusion that technology makes us perfectly safe, and that the technology that exists in the car keeps us from drifting lanes. It's collision avoidance. All of those different things, I think, give us the belief that we are safer than we really are. I think we've normalized speeding and high speeds over time, and that's the normalizing of that has led to us feeling more comfortable driving rates we wouldn't have felt comfortable driving in the past. And I suspect that the handling of the car also does that. I mean, just the existence of the 0 to 60 in 2 seconds button suggests that people think they can handle that. The I think that another big element here is the distraction element, that people believe that they can handle distraction. They think that they can multitask. And I think that, car manufacturers have provided all sorts of tools to allow for that. And so, the giant screens that exist in cars and all of that, I think people have embraced the idea that, hey, look, I am able to do this. And then they take advantage of it. So I think all of those different sort of delusions, just even separate from the anger piece, which I know we're going to talk about, but even separate from that, I think is all a big part of this picture. And I'll just to go back to the piece about me, teaching my 15-year-old to drive. One of the things I've noticed is just the difference in him from the very first time he drove to even the fourth time, that as he got more comfortable, he started to make more mistakes. And I can sense that as I am trying to help him here, that like as he, in the beginning, it's like he didn't want to do anything without getting some clear instructions from me. But as he started to feel like, okay, this is a thing I know how to do, he started to make more little errors, right? And I suspect that that's in some ways analogous to the big picture. As we have gotten more comfortable driving, we have started to make more mistakes. We've started to make more bad decisions.
Right. First of all, Godspeed. God bless your effort.
Thank you.
For this process, which I think all of us with children are terrified of, but I can entirely relate. The thought that you can handle these that we have these apps now that yes, there's an obstruction on the road. Oh, wonderful! Thank you for telling me.
Yes.
Well, how did
Yep.
that obstruction get into the app? Somebody in the middle of their driving pulled up the menu and selected there's an obstruction on the road, and there's an expectation now that we can handle something like that, despite the fact that the statistics say that distracted drivers are up to 23 times more likely to cause a crash than those who are honed in. Whereas alcohol, on the other hand, is only between 4 and 23 times more likely. So that means that distracted drivers are as dangerous at best, or 5 times more dangerous than drunk drivers at worst. And here we are installing giant screens, XM Sirius radio, all of these. Can you pinpoint, like, what do you, in your opinion, what is the largest threat to drivers right now? Is it this sense of
Yeah. I think it is. I think I would argue it's distraction, but I would even add to it that it isn't the problem with distraction. It isn't. I mean, yes, it's the screen, it's the phone, it's all those things. I think the biggest problem though is the belief that we can safely multitask, and that's what's doing so much harm is this idea that like that I'm even able to do this. And that belief, by the way, extends well outside of the driving world, right? I mean, we see that belief in kids studying for finals. We see that belief in all sorts of places. This idea that, hey, look, I can do multiple things at once. And ultimately, we know that's not true. Um, there's another psychological factor, though, that we haven't really touched on that I think is related here, and it's narcissism. And that we know that narcissism is a significant predictor of aggressive driving, and even risky driving. And those two things are similar, but or overlap, but different. And I suspect that that narcissism is a big piece of what drives, I guess pun intended, the tendency to be distracted. I think that there is a sense of, well, maybe other people can't multitask, but I can. Or maybe this behavior isn't safe for other people, whatever that behavior is, but I'm able to do it. And it's in some ways it feels like an extension of that teenage sort of mindset of, well, the bad thing won't happen to me. The bad thing happens to other people, but it would never happen to me until it does. And I think that that is a part of what's going on. And I think a big piece of that is potentially the ego and the narcissism that so often comes along. I bet it's correlated with a lot. I don't know this, but I bet it's correlated with a lot of the other factors we've talking about, a desire for large cars, the status symbol element. I bet all of those things are related to narcissism. And I'm not just, to be clear, not just talking about sort of diagnosable narcissism. I'm just talking about that as a personality trait, that ego as a personality trait.
I love that answer because I think the narcissism is also contributing to this idea that my time is more important than yours. I'm in more hurry than you are, so I'm going to get in front of you in this. And all of this frustration compiled together results in even sort of the gentlest people getting frustrated behind the wheel of a car. I mean, AAA has this study out that confirms just an alarming number of drivers who say that in their normal lives, they're otherwise sweet and gentle and polite people who admit cutting people off or tailgating or even bumping other cars or taking out mirrors as they pass. So, I mean, what happens to the brain of a regular human being when they get behind the wheel of a car? Is there a sense of anonymity as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I've said this before, a bunch. If you're an evil genius and you want to create a situation that will make people mad, you would create a situation that looks a lot like driving. It is essentially a perfect recipe for anger. And the reasons for that are, so when we think about the circumstances that lead to anger, a big piece of that is poor treatment and or goal blocking. By goal blocking, I mean I'm trying to do something or accomplish something, and something is slowing me down. Well, driving by definition, you are on your way somewhere. And so it's very easy to have your goals blocked en route to that thing. And there's a billion possibilities there. There's the behavior of other drivers, there's bad weather, there's traffic, there's road construction, all these things that interfere with your goals. Then on top of that, you are surrounded by these anonymous other people. And so you can make any assumption you want about them, and you'll never be proven false, likely. You can decide they're idiots, they're monsters, they're fools, whatever. You can assign all of these negative statements to who they are. You are anonymous to them by and large, so it doesn't feel like there's any consequences to your behavior and your treatment of them. And so that includes, intentional aggressive responses, whether it's giving people the finger or brake checking or whatever, or cutting people off. And then on top of all of that, and this is the part that I think that people don't necessarily realize, is that we're talking about a dangerous activity that keys us up or cues us up for some level of anxiety, whether we're sort of aware of it or not. And because of that, we're already kind of primed for emotionality in those circumstances. And so my heart rate might be a little bit elevated. I'm sort of already queued up and primed for something, and then something happens. Someone cuts me off. I get stuck at a red light that I didn't think I should be stuck at, or whatever, and I lose my cool. Um, and because of all those things coming together, you're absolutely right that people who don't necessarily experience anger in other parts of their life experience anger while driving, because it is this sort of perfect storm.
Absolutely. In my own therapy sessions, I've explored a technique called radical acceptance, which has been extremely useful in traffic as well as
Mhm.
the rest of my life. Are there any coping mechanisms for the rest of us normal human beings out there that maybe you could recommend? Give us a little advice here.
Yeah, one of the first things I would say is that I think there's a mindset shift that a lot of people need to have, and I say this as someone who, so the topic of my books on anger are actually that anger is a relatively healthy and misunderstood emotion, and that people should experience it more often and just channel it into productive ways. None of that is true when you're on the road. When you're on the road, anger is, I would argue, purely destructive. I think it's purely harmful. And I think that people need to have a little bit of a mindset shift and acknowledge that anger while driving is something they want to avoid. That, and if they're, and that any kind of uh, altercation on the road that is motivated by anger, whether you're the angry one or the other person is the angry one, should be avoided. And so for me, what that mindset means, that if somebody cuts me off, I don't want to get revenge. I don't want to get back at them. I don't want to be anywhere near them, right? The smart thing to do is just kind of back away and get away from that. But I think a lot of people embrace sort of a revenge mindset, almost like this sort of on the road vigilantism of like, hey, he can't do that or she can't do that. So I'm gonna ride their bumper for a while, or I'm gonna honk, or I'm gonna cut them off, or whatever. None of that is going to lead to a positive outcome. So I think step one is acknowledging that. I do think there's a lot of situation, like sometimes we exacerbate the anger we experience by through some, I think, I guess, bad decisions we make in advance, right? So we let ourselves get behind, and so we're feeling even more rushed. That getting stopped at that unnecessary stoplight or traffic or whatever isn't so bad if you've allowed enough time. And I think sometimes when people let themselves get into situations where they're feeling stressed or rushed, it makes that even worse. For me, I'll admit one of the points that I'm likely to get angry is whenever I let myself get low on gas. This is something that I know, like in my mind, every like delay is a reason why I'm going to run out of gas on the side of the road, right? And so everything feels more catastrophic than it actually is. So I think that we can make some decisions in how we choose to travel that can make us less likely to get angry. To answer your question, one quick thing to say is like when provoked, what are the things, either intentionally through an aggressive act or just we experience some sort of provocation? I think it is really about having some of those mechanisms, like the deep breathing, the telling yourself, the radical acceptance is a great one. Telling yourself, hey, look, this is reminding yourself what the smart thing to do is in those situations.
Giving others the benefit of the doubt, probably
Yes.
that maybe they had a good reason for it, or
Yep.
alternatively understanding that you're probably not going to permanently alter their behavior by bad
Right.
behavior of your own, right? I mean, the good news is we're heading towards autonomous cars, so we remove the human emotions right out of it. Is that right? I think that'll solve everything. Arthur, I know that you have something to say on this, on how autonomous vehicles are going to begin to affect the way that we drive.
Yeah, so as I was listening to Professor Martin speak, I mean, there's so much truth in all that. And I was just imagining with my, the kind of Waymo engineer or the Tesla engineer saying, well, everything will be awesome when we have autonomous cars, so none of this will be an issue. And I guess one of the big myths we seek to dispel in our book Roadkill is that we shouldn't fall for this attempt at selling us a new future. The risks of autonomous cars are so many, we won't have time to go into full detail here, but the two I wanted to touch on briefly in terms of kind of our inability to accurately predict some of the risks that are coming down the thing. The first is around cybersecurity, and it's one that was brought to my attention first by General David Petraeus, who wrote an amazing book called Conflict, working with the historian Andrew Roberts. And in it talks a lot about cyberkinetic warfare. And this is an idea where you can essentially use the Internet of Things to hijack objects and then use them as weapons. And I heard you and Daniel, you and Matthew talking about the Tesla as a weapon earlier. I mean, an advanced kind of high-end modern car has around 100 different attack vectors on a single car. For a hacker to be able to hijack it with. If we look at then drilling down into an advanced modern car, there's around 100 million lines of code, computer code that's written into a car as well at that point there. And then what's going to happen is that we have so many different operating systems, different hardware manufacturers, different software manufacturers who are going to proliferate across this. And so the number of options for hackers to be able to use to actually just be able to take over cars, either groups of cars at a time, operating systems at a time, different hardwares, Trojans, or those elements to be able to then use those cars as weapons to, or indeed just to freeze them or to hijack parts of the city. And we've already begun to see this a bit. There's a hacking software called Parrot OS, which since 2022, there's been a literal drop-down preset menu. So it's essentially a hacking software that you can upload to your computer, and it gives you options of kind of think of it almost saying, what do you want to hack? And it then presets the hacking to be able to do that. And since 2022, there's been a hack an autonomous car preset software for you to be able to do it. So this is already here.
And General Petraeus's writings, by the way, on the Internet of Things have me terrified of my own stove. I mean, I'm very, very worried that everything seems to be hackable these days, but obviously my stove is not a 2-ton hunk of steel flying at 65 miles per hour down the road. So I think there's great danger there. With all these technologies, I mean, there are several others. Matt, you also have talked a little bit about the fact that many countries use speed cameras. So this is another crazy piece of technology, which guarantee that with or without traffic cops, at least speed limits should be enforced. And you quoted in one of your articles a state trooper saying, anything that increases the certainty of being caught is going to make a dramatic difference. So where have these cameras been most effective, and why don't we see more of them in the United States?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. It's something I thought about a lot while writing this piece. My editor and I don't usually argue, but we argued about this part of the story, which has to do with enforcement. Enforcement works, right? Like it's undeniable that under the right circumstances, increased police visibility, the threat of being ticketed, the certain technological infrastructure will help you stay safe as a driver and help pedestrians stay safe. However, in the US, we also know that far too many young Black men and women have been killed during traffic stops. We have a strong libertarian streak in our country where people don't like to be surveyed. They don't like the idea of being under surveillance. It's almost like what's so fascinating about it's like two poles, right? It's like on the one hand, you have a liberal fear of too much law enforcement on the streets, too many cops, too many interactions between police and drivers. And on the other, you have more conservative folks who say they just don't want this in the US. And between those two positions, a lot of communities, including near where I am in Atlanta, have effectively said we're not going to have speed cameras in our community, even though in most cities and towns, the technology is already implanted on a lot of the stoplights that you drive through. It's a matter of actually turning them on, but they're not turned on. I think it's a really interesting question, deserving of the debate that it will never get in the current political climate or in the US or anywhere else. But it's like, I mean, I'd put it simply, we have the technology to bring a lot of this behavior under control. And I often find myself thinking, when I see someone speeding past me on the road or someone tailgating me, I'm like, oh man, where are the police right now? Why aren't the cops pulling this person over? And then I stop to think about what that would mean on a larger scale. But I don't want to keep bringing it back to the gun debate, but it's analogous in the same way. It's like, we know what could make people stop being killed by so many guns. We could change how they procure guns. We could change how long people have to wait to get a gun. In the same way, we could say, hey, we're going to put up speed cameras everywhere. We're going to delegate more police to watch the roads at certain junctures. We're going to install more radar trucks to monitor people's speed. But that's a political appetite thing. That's a community appetite thing. And I'm just not sure we're there. I mean, I don't like it was fascinating doing this research and talking to a lot of police officers who would have loved more of this technology out there because they're tired of seeing people be killed on the roads. But, in the legislature, in their local legislature, in the state, at the national level, there's just not the political will to get it done. And I mean, what makes this even more depressing is when I wrote the piece, Pete Buttigieg was still the Secretary of Transportation and was thinking about all of this stuff really hard. It would be hard to think of a more public transportation and pedestrian minded human being than Pete Buttigieg in that role. And he is no longer there. And his focus, which was able to really devote a lot of dollars towards safer streets and more pedestrian friendly streets and more law enforcement and more traffic cams, is just being eroded. But I don't know. I don't mean to just kind of shrug my shoulders, but I do really firmly feel this. Like if we wanted this, if we decided as a country we want this to happen, we want to be safer, we could be safer if we wanted to. It's not like out of the bounds of possibility, right? It's not an impossible thing. And the last thing I'll say about all this is, I'm 44, so I grew up at a time after these car wars had already happened in the 60s and 70s and the early 80s when people were just being ejected nonstop from cars and being impaled on steering wheel columns, and fatalities were through the roof. And it did eventually get to the point where people were like, okay, this is not okay anymore. We have to change this. We must change this. And they did. The difference there is that we still had a political apparatus and a Congress that worked. We still had a government that worked and that was able to pass big sweeping legislation, like the stuff that led to having more seatbelts and airbags and having cars be safer. So I'm listening to myself be really skeptical and doomsday about it, but I don't, it's very hard for me to see how we get out of this, I suppose.
Well, again, the traffic enforcement when you're driving 100 trillion miles, as Arthur mentioned, is there. There is no police force in the world, whether fair-minded or not, that's ever going to be able to enforce that with that many people driving that many hours and that many miles on the road. I do think that that's one of the arguments for these speed cameras is that there they are permanently, but again, politically, culturally, as Ryan mentioned, the narcissism of you can't take, you mentioned libertarianism in this country is like, that's a violation of my ability to go very, very fast. In David Opes' book, I laughed out loud when I read that the first speeding ticket, I think it was 1888, was given on a New York street for somebody who had the audacity to go 12 miles per hour. How dare they? But that's at a time when there's so few cars on the street that you notice the guy going 12 miles per hour amidst the pedestrians. Arthur, just from a European perspective, are speed controls, speed cameras something that is permeating society over there? And are they effective? Are they useful? Is that something that governments are embracing?
Yeah, they've been broadly implemented, and I guess generally they're a both revenue raising exercise and also enforcement exercise. One of the things I do is I sit on the board of Transport for London, which is the biggest integrated public transit authority and road management authority in Europe. And part of that role is that we have different taxation systems to try and nudge people through positive and negative incentives towards other means. And the key part of this is obviously, traffic enforcement is one crucial element of this. But the other side of this, and where I think the United States has still a very long way to go, is to provide genuine, affordable, desirable, safe, reliable alternatives. And with that, it's going to be banging on a door of essentially only stick and no carrot. And I think that, so it does need to be, you mentioned Pete Buttigieg earlier, in terms of making a step to try and kind of at least raise debate and put some funding towards that. But that's the key piece, to provide those alternatives and to try and knit together some of these very low density suburban and exurban communities that have been built post the kind of rise of the car industrial complex and built around the car, and how you can re-knit those together. An area that I'm really interested in, which I don't think we'll have time to get into today, is because a lot of those 100 trillion miles, I mentioned that journey from 17 to 100 is going to be through the emerging middle class in the global south. So huge populations. I mean, we talk about the rise of China and driving in China because of things like BYD and the huge electric car adoption there. Still only just under 20%, 20% of households in China have access to a car. In India, the most populous country in the world now, 8% have access to a car. In sub-Saharan Africa, the continent that's going to see the biggest demographic shift, biggest economic shift this century, 4% have access to a car. In America, it's somewhere between 92 and 94%. So if these big, I mean, I get it. We're in the Cambridge Forum and we are naturally, America is the most important country in the world, and we need to focus on that because that's a model which others look at and aspire towards. But where we're going to see these really radical shifts in terms of how the world moves, what is the either the first or the second most expensive thing anyone spends their money on throughout their lifetime, the most likely thing to kill you until you're about 50, the biggest cause of air pollution, the biggest cause of light pollution, the biggest cause of noise pollution, the biggest cause of a lot of things. And that's the kind of where we think the kind of the big battleground. America's kind of, it's here, and to drag it is going to be a lot of work to drag it back from 94% to 84% to 74%, and that is a huge and important effort. But the hearts and minds of those in the global south are still yet to be won, and that's where I think a lot of the people listening today and my fellow panelists, I'd love to maybe reconvene in a few short months to have a kind of a Cambridge forum, thinking about some of the ideas about the global south and how the hearts and minds can be won with that vision of staying on two wheels in a good way rather than through the lack of economic prosperity, which is why a lot of them are still on two wheels today.
Well, it feels like some of it might be education as well. The statistics that we've mentioned this evening, I feel like if you're a compassionate human being in any way, shape, or form, how could you possibly ignore these things? But we're not necessarily putting these things forward. The average driver's ed class is between 30 and 40 hours. So, right, it takes you an entire semester to learn algebra, which you may or may not apply to your real life. But this thing that you're going to spend 50 years inside of, this car, you're expected that you can just learn it in 30 or 40 hours, and then we'll never address that again. There's no, additional learning, adult education for it. We have in the United States drivers in crash testing positive for at least one active drug. These cases rose 65% since the pandemic. I mean, Ryan, maybe you can comment on this a little bit. Is more education going to be more effective in terms of solving some of these problems, or is that something that's a hopeless avenue as well?
Yeah. I want to say it will help. I believe, I mean, I'm a teacher, right? So I like to believe it will help. I do think, though, that by and large, I mean, I do think that there's an absence of awareness of a lot of the things that we're talking about right now. I think that's absolutely true, and that as that awareness increases, we'll see potentially more effort. But that said, and maybe this is drives. I'm thinking back to what Matt said earlier about what we really have right now is a lack of political will to address some of the problems we're talking about. And I guess maybe education will increase the political will, or awareness will increase that political will, and at least in theory. Um, I tend to be of the opinion that human beings will do what they feel comfortable doing. And because we have set cars up in such a way that human beings feel comfortable going fast, being distracted, and all of these negative ways, potentially even drinking in, or because they've been set up. And when I say the cars have been set that way, I mean the culture and cars have been set up that way. I think people are going to keep doing that until we provide a combination of alternatives and consequences.
It feels like there needs to be also some onus on the actual car manufacturers themselves. I mean, a lot of these places, very famously, Volkswagen had that little machine that performed differently in the tests than it did on the road. And they did this almost nefariously. Nevertheless, most of these corporations have an ethics department that's considering things and trying to up safety. And I think that may be some of the problem for these large vehicles, right? The larger you are, the less likely you are to die in a crash. Or the brightness of the halogen lamps is something that I've heard a lot of complaints about, is from the audience as well this evening, is that you have these ultra shining, retina penetrating lights that help you to see on the road, but what about the other drivers on the road? So unfortunately, I think there is sometimes these manufacturers have slight odds when it comes to ethics and safety versus profit as well. And so we are running out of time. I'm conscientious that Arthur is up after midnight speaking to us. We've already gone a little bit over. I just wanted to see, do you folks have final thoughts in terms of who wins in terms of consumer safety when the car manufacturers are addressing these types of issues?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I'm going to leave that to someone else. I do have one last thought that I've been thinking about while everyone's been talking, and I got this out of I was lucky enough to interview Ryan for the Times article. I do think that there's a normalization of behavior, at least in the United States, that seems to be occurring on a mass scale that could be addressed through education or awareness. I do feel this very strongly in Atlanta, where I live, that if you spend enough time on the road and everyone's driving around you like an absolute maniac, it becomes part of how you behave on the road too, no matter how much you might like to not behave that way. And I worry that the pandemic made it worse, as it made so many of our other behaviors worse. So I don't know. I just wanted to say that because I do feel like I don't want to, I think there is a collective responsibility here on the part of all of us to recognize that we're all affected by this in some way, that driving in angry traffic, driving more miles than we've ever driven in human history has a cost on all of us, has a real effect, and that we've just got to be careful and try our best to take Ryan's advice and not get riled up. Although, even like I remember interviewing Ryan, and then I got in the car and someone cut me off, and I immediately held up my middle finger. So don't listen to me. Listen to Ryan instead.
Yeah.
You got a final thought about that, Ryan?
Well, I will confess that I once gave someone the finger and was chased through a Walmart parking lot in Mississippi, and narrowly avoided an altercation. So that was a long time ago, and I learned a valuable lesson. So um, no, I think my one of the thoughts I keep coming back to. I live in a community that I love, but does not have much available to me in when it comes to public transportation or alternatives to driving. There just isn't much. There could be. We're in that sort of weird size. Be fascinated to hear Arthur's take on it. We're in that sort of weird size city that transportation is hard to get going, but we also have the problems of that come with not having it, right? So, but I do think going back to something I said before, that it people will do what is easy and comfortable to them, and if you don't provide alternatives, and if you make the thing that that's dangerous too easy, um, then that you're going to get what we've got. And I think that, the same way this problem is really, really complicated, and there's a lot of different elements causing it. There's got to be a lot of different solutions to addressing it. And I think those include a lot of the things that the other panelists have brought up, as far as what we can do with the communities we are in, what we can do with enforcement, and so on.
Arthur, can you give us one final thought here? Close us out.
I mean, that was summed up really beautifully. I mean, I was lucky enough to write the book Road to with, and so I mean, we do all of this stuff in terms of technical solutions, in terms of urban design, in terms of that crucial point Professor Martin mentioned, in terms of the urban form and how incrementally denser cities provide the economic platform to provide things like public transit and walkability. But why writing it with a philosopher and anthropologist was so amazing and important was because we feel that a lot of the reason that we had things like culture wars over things like 15-minute cities, and in the UK, things like low traffic neighborhoods and stuff like that, and about the car, is because some of those arguments about what the good life is, why we want, how we can live better together in cities, even in a libertarian sense. I mean, it doesn't need to be anything progressive. It could be we open the book talking about your freedom. We then talk about your money. We talk about your time, your health, your happiness. We're trying to make it very direct and incisive and kind of greedy. We're saying this is the stuff you own and you're giving it away to the car. And so we felt that writing with a philosopher gives that rich underpinning, those hearts and minds pieces. I say that we still have the option in some of these big countries in the global south to say, this is what a good life could be, and think really deeply about what freedoms you have, what freedoms you're giving away, and also what freedoms you can expand. You don't know you have yet, but actually you could get greater freedoms from building a better relationship with the car. It's not saying zero cars, it's saying how can you build a positive, healthy one and invite it into your life when you want it there, not it telling you when to go, how to go, and how much they're going to charge you for the joy of it.
What a phenomenal
So
note.
a huge thanks, Daniel, and the whole team for having us, and for the audience for joining today.
Absolutely. I would love to thank all of you. So thank you so much to Matt Scher, Arthur Kay, and Ryan Martin for their valuable time and presence today on today's forum. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vedder, the Lowell Institute, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and of course, you out there in the audience. So if you think the discussion of these issues is as important as we do, please consider expressing that sentiment with contribution. The forum is free to you, but it is not free to make. So kindly give what you can afford via our website, which is www.cambridgeforum.org. cambridgeforum.org, where you can also sign up for our e-newsletter. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you for being so generous with me on my first go at this, and I'll look forward to seeing all of you on the 4th. Thanks again, and have a great night. Take care, folks.